Well, I'd like to welcome you all to our second annual lecture on Afghanistan from the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies. The American Institute of Afghanistan Studies is proud, it's hard for us to believe, but we are now celebrating our 15th anniversary of our founding. Today, we're a consortium of about 30 research universities in the United States, all of whom have some interest, or at least faculty who have interest in Afghanistan. And one of the things that we're most proud of is that we have a research center in Kabul that's almost as old as our organization, and it's still in operation. We've now moved to the American University campus, where we've established a cooperative relation with the American University of Afghanistan, and which we hope to invite you, perhaps in a year, to see our new building when we get it set up. As part of our commitment to Afghanistan, both international scholarship of Afghanistan. We've helped many international scholars from all parts of the world think about doing their research in Afghanistan. Our directors have been very well informed, and as those of you who are familiar with Afghanistan know, there's very little bureaucracy to stand in your way, but if you don't know people, you won't get anywhere. Our staff knows people. We also know what is possible to do. Many people have great ideas, and we can tell them, like interviewing the head of the Taliban in his own house in Uruzgan may not be the best for your long-term thesis interest. We've been very good at helping people get to do their research, to understand research in Afghanistan, but we're also very proud of the number of Afghan scholars that we've helped nurture, many of whom are here, with grants that we've had, but with lectures and others, because we see the international study of Afghanistan as a cooperation between Afghanistan, Afghans, and the international community. And we're very proud over this period of time that there's a new generation of scholars. I'm very proud, and my colleagues are very proud of our old work in Afghanistan. But what we've said is Afghanistan needs new and fresh eyes, and we're very happy to have them coming into being. We're very pleased tonight to have Steve Coll lecture to us. He's very well known to the audience. Steve Coll is Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. He's also a staff writer for The New Yorker, which is where I often read what he's writing on next. He reports on issues of intelligence, national security in the United States and abroad. For the magazine, he's written about the education of Osama bin Laden's secret negotiations between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and the hunt for fugitive Taliban leader Mohammed Omar, who, like General Franco, was finally found dead. He was the managing editor of the Washington Post between 1998 and 2005. And before that, he was a feature writer at that newspaper. He's written quite a number of books, won a number of prizes, including a Pulitzer for his work at the Washington Post. His published works that are of greatest interest, I'm sure, to this audience is The Bin Ladens, An Arabian Family in the American Century, for which he won the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for nonfiction. Famously, Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden, from the Soviet invasion to September 10th, 2001, for which he received Overseas Press Club Award and a Pulitzer Prize. His most recent and really great book, for those of you who have not yet read it, is Directorate S, The CIA and America's Secret War in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And for those of you who have not yet had the pleasure of reading his books, we have these books available for purchase at the back after the lecture, and Steve will be happy to sign it. I will say we will have the lecture first, then we will have about a half hour of questions. A mic will be brought if you're asking questions. And for those of you who say, but my voice is loud, this is a small room, we're recording this. Without the microphone, no one outside this room will hear you. So be aware of the need for that and wait for the microphone to be brought to you. Steve?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for coming out. Congratulations to you and your colleagues on 15 years. It's fantastic and important. Thank you for thoughtfully having books for sale. For those of you who celebrate Christmas, nothing says I love you like a book about a war in Afghanistan, but anyway, I appreciate it. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the work, and so just to make this talk, give it a little bit of instant context. So I was a reporter at the Washington Post. I became a foreign correspondent. I was assigned to South Asia. I went out to live in Delhi, and I covered Afghanistan for several years as part of that assignment. This was in the early 90s. Then I went to London as a roving international investigative correspondent, came back to the region a lot, wrote about Al-Qaeda, bin Laden in the 90s, and then after 2001, I wrote Ghost Wars, which was about, after 9/11, it was intended to provide a record for Americans who were still pretty confused about where this had come from, but also Afghans and others in the region about what the origins of the 9/11 attacks looked like in the context of the U.S. involvement in the Afghan war during the Mujahideen period, and then the aftermath, the rise of the Taliban. So as Tom says, it sort of starts in 1979 with the Soviet invasion. It ends on September 10th. And then this book, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, the themes in it, the narrative in it, is intended as a kind of second volume of Ghost Wars. It's something you can read independently, but it starts where Ghost Wars ends, and it comes forward to something like the present day. And it's not an easy book to summarize in half an hour, but I'm going to try to pull out some themes and some episodes that I think are the most important ones for understanding the U.S. experience in Afghanistan since 2001. And I've got some pictures just so you don't have to listen to me talk, and this one might be recognizable to some of you. That is a photograph of the last armored column of the 40th Soviet Army, the so-called limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan on February 15, 1989, as the occupation force crossed over the Friendship Bridge above the Amu Darya River. And the last commander of the Soviet force in Afghanistan was a guy named Boris Gromov, and shortly after this picture was taken, he was in the last armored personnel carrier. He got down on the pavement, turned his back on Afghanistan, walked across the bridge into what was then the Soviet Union, and his son greeted him with a bouquet of flowers. And that was the end of the Soviet misadventure in Afghanistan. And it was the first of two times that a great power has tried to leave Afghanistan in the last few decades. More recently, in December 2014, the Obama administration staged a ceremony at ISAF headquarters in downtown Kabul, where they were intending to formally end U.S. combat operations in the Afghan war and hand off their presence to the Afghan security forces as supporters under Operation Resolute Support. And so they assembled in a basketball gym, and there were a lot of dignitaries there, and there was a band, and the security situation was such that they handed out a kind of an agenda for the ceremony that had instructions about how to get down on the floor and cover your head in the case of a Taliban rocket attack during the ceremony. So it was a kind of a leaving without leaving compared to the Soviet example. That's a picture of it inside the gymnasium. And in fact, a year later, the United States was formally back at war in Afghanistan against, this time, a branch of the Islamic State that, as many of you know, has sprung up in Nangarhar. And so we remain at war in Afghanistan here in 2018, fighting two different kinds of war: direct counterterrorism combat against the Islamic State and allied groups, and then continuing with the support mission with Afghan security forces in the lead. So those two stories give you an idea of how difficult it has been for big armies to come into Afghanistan and stabilize the country when determined rebel forces have a sanctuary across the border in Pakistan, which is probably, from a military strategy perspective, the hardest problem that the Afghan war has presented. It was the hardest problem that the Soviets faced, and it has been the hardest problem for the United States. So in talking about the US war in Afghanistan since 2001 and the US experience, I guess the question that I want to concentrate on in my half hour is essentially why the United States, across two administrations led by the two major political parties, proved unable to achieve American goals, NATO goals in Afghanistan. Why did these two administrations allow the problem of Pakistani sanctuary and the role of the Pakistani intelligence service, which is ISI is the way we commonly refer to it, to foster a comeback by the Taliban, even while Pakistan was receiving hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars in aid from American taxpayers and was treated as a major non-NATO ally by the United States. It's very rare that the United States, in its history, even its post-war history of strange bedfellows and cynical arrangements, has given so much support to a government whose intelligence service was actively facilitating the deaths of American soldiers on a battlefield. I'm not sure there is a precedent for that in American history. And yet neither the Bush administration nor the Obama administration could find the will or the strategy to change the war, to stabilize Afghanistan, to reduce the violence that began to gather after 2005. So why? What were the big struggles that bring all of these episodes together? So I want to talk about four of them. One, and this is really, the book tries to narrate this complicated set of interlocking struggles and failures from the American perspective, the Pakistani perspective, and the Afghan perspective. Inevitably, I understand the American system the best. And tonight, I really am going to concentrate on why US policy failed, in my judgment, across this long period of time. So there's four themes I want to focus on. One is the problem of war aims. Why are we there exactly? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And how many contradictions and confusions built up in the US system around that question. Secondly, the failure of our relationship with Hamid Karzai across his two terms as president, and to some extent of our investments in democratic politics in Afghanistan more broadly. Third, the illusions of counterinsurgency doctrine that governed the big surge of American forces into the country during the first Obama term. And finally, the failure of our political and diplomatic strategy across a long period of time, but I would say particularly during the period after 2006. So war aims. One of the histories that I tried to excavate in Directorate S, and there's a lot of episodes and a lot of meetings in the Situation Room and across the way from the West Wing, there's this big kind of Rococo building called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, and there's a secure conference room on the fourth floor where the kind of deputies and the people down from the cabinet often meet to discuss policy. What's our strategy? And they conduct these reviews, and they're very rigorous. They bring in the intelligence agencies who brief up all the facts that they can synthesize to try to inform the policy decision. People write white papers, they propose changes in strategy, they debate. And in digging all of this out, it was sort of depressing to discover that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had been in that conference room, and then later with the higher ranking officials in the Situation Room, talking about the same problems, the same dilemmas over and over again, really from about 2005, 2006, right through until the Trump administration did one in the first 6 months of 2017 in the same places and with many of the same people, in fact. And the repetition of these discussions, does the drug trafficking and the poppy problem in southern Afghanistan, does it matter? Should it be part of our war or not? How do we judge corruption? How do we do something about it? What do we do about ISI's interference in the war? What pressure can we afford to put on Pakistan? What is the right number of troops that NATO should have on the ground, and how long can they stay, and how can they be effective? These were discussed again and again. And at the heart of it was a question that policymakers are meant to ask. Certainly, as a taxpayer, you hope they are, especially when they're asking young men and women to go fight in a distant land, and to make, in many cases, thousands in this war, the ultimate sacrifice, which is, what are the vital interests of the United States in Afghanistan that justify the sacrifice of lives and the expenditure of great sums? And then, having identified those interests, what is the strategy that will actually achieve them in a sustainable way? And in these conference rooms and in the Situation Room, as I say, across two administrations, the principals, the advisors, the experts, they had a great deal of trouble answering those questions in a consistent way. I'll give you one example. When the Obama administration came in 2009, they conducted two very rigorous reviews of the Afghan war. And of course, these are all smart, well-intentioned, well-informed people. They're not cynical about their work, and they are trying to identify vital interests of the United States that they can defend. And this was in the context of sending more troops to Afghanistan, tens of thousands initially decided on early in 2009. Ultimately, 100,000 American troops were in Afghanistan at the peak of the surge during the Obama years, 150,000-ish international troops in total carrying out the counterinsurgency campaign. And in the review that essentially authorized that large deployment, the principals and the experts identified two truly vital interests in the war. One from the American perspective. One was Al-Qaeda, which was still very active, carrying out conspiracies overseas in Europe against the United States, and was mostly located in Waziristan. The second vital interest was the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Pakistan was then quite unstable, and there was an anxiety that if the weapons fell into and was ridden with radical groups on its own soil, and there was an anxiety that if these weapons fell into the wrong hands, you could have a real catastrophe. But then, of course, think about it. Those are the two vital interests that we're sending 150,000 troops to Afghanistan to defend. Neither of them is geographically located in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was in Pakistan. Pakistan's nuclear weapons were in Pakistan. So that's a kind of indirect reason to fight a war. Someone pointed out the contradiction, and they acknowledged it, and they said, well, we have to do it this way because we can't invade Pakistan, and in any event, if Afghanistan falls apart and we have another civil war, then Al-Qaeda will come back into Afghanistan, and we could have exactly the same problem that we had in the 90s. All right, there's logic in that. But again, it wasn't a very direct reason to ask young men and women to go into harm's way, and it wasn't really made clear to the American public what the war was about in the minds of those who had devised it. The real problem was the Taliban. Obama could not figure out how to resource a war against the Taliban that could be won on any timeline that he was willing to accept. And there was a big debate over and over again in these conference rooms about whether the Taliban were really the enemy of the United States. They were clearly the enemy of the constitutional government in Afghanistan, and there was a consensus that the United States should support the constitutional government of Afghanistan, including with military aid and advice and assistance. But were the Taliban really the enemy of the United States? Was it the American job to defeat the Taliban? At one point, Obama's White House aides, knowing that he really was skeptical about a war against the Taliban, and having pointed out there were no Afghans on the 9/11 planes, there There's only one or two instances across all this terrorism where Afghan nationals have been involved in terrorist conspiracies against American targets, certainly not in an organized way. The Taliban hadn't been involved in such conspiracies outside of the region, certainly not outside, on the New York subways. And so why are they a vital interest of the United States? And at one point, the White House aides, knowing how skeptical Obama was about this, said, well, have we ever really said we're going to defeat the Taliban? I'm not sure we've ever really made that promise. We've talked about safe harbor. We've talked about their moral culpability for 9/11 because they gave sanctuary to al-Qaeda as the attacks were planned. But we've never really said we're going to defeat them in a war. And the next day, the Pentagon team came back with a big PowerPoint deck filled with all the quotations from national leaders since September 11th, pledging to defeat the Taliban. Said, you may not want to sign up for this, but you have exactly said it over and over and over again. So in the end, when the big surge was announced, the Obama administration used this kind of language that as an editor you would find a little bit frustrating. It said that the purpose of the US deployment was to degrade the Taliban or reverse its momentum, which is not normally a measure of war, of combat, and also kind of a vague standard that you can sort of grade your own homework on. We'll come back to a little bit of this problem of the Taliban, but let's talk about this man. Now, when I was a beat reporter in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Hamid Karzai was a well-known kind of figure around Peshawar in a certain era, and then later when he was deputy foreign minister after the fall of Najibullah, he was someone that a lot of us had covered as beat reporters. We'd interviewed him, we'd been to press conferences with him. I thought I had a sense of him as a political figure and as an individual. But of course, he ended up acquiring a very bad reputation in the West because of his skepticism about US policy and his outspokenness and his seemingly erratic and inconsistent statements and decisions. And certainly there was quite a lot of that to be seen. But I was honestly surprised when I kind of excavated this history and tried to document as many of the meetings that he had in private with American leaders, American officials over the years, trying to get to the substance of those meetings, what was said, what did he say, what posture did he take in private. And the most striking thing was that he was utterly consistent with Americans, with Europeans, about one thing, which was that the heart of the war was in Pakistan. And his basic question was, why aren't you doing anything about it? Again and again, he would start a meeting by saying, the problem is ISI, and you're complicit with their interference in our country. Why aren't you doing something about it? And the Americans would say, yes, but there's a problem with opium. Yes, but there's a problem with corruption. There is a scene where candidate Obama flies into Afghanistan with a couple of senators for the first time in the summer of 2008. He's been nominated, or he's about to be nominated by the Democratic Party, and the Karzai organizes the cabinet for a meeting with him. Somebody gave Obama the advice that the first thing he should do is go to Jalalabad and meet Gul Agha Shirzai, which, for those of you who know what that means, is like the worst advice that a presidential candidate has ever gotten. But in any event, back to our main story, Karzai organizes the cabinet, fractious, they don't agree on much, and they say, look, this guy could be president. He's going to come in, we're going to have lunch, everyone can make one comment in a circle. We're a diverse group, but let's talk about what it is we want him to hear. And they all agreed. Let's just say, Mr. Senator Obama, the problem that you have to solve is Pakistan's interference in the war and ISI's support for the Taliban. And they went around the table and everyone said it to him. And the president seemed like, really? Okay. Can the civilian government do much about that in Pakistan? No, Senator, they can't. You're going to have to work on this yourself. But this was a typical kind of transition in our partisan system where the incoming group almost took it for granted that everything the outgoing group had done was wrong and that they needed to fix it. And one of the things they assumed was wrong was that President Bush had coddled Karzai by working so hard to maintain a tight relationship with him, having these video conferences every other week to talk about how things were going, giving Karzai a lot of support, hang in there. And it was a very Bush family way of building personal relationships at the heart of US foreign policy. And the Obama team came in and said, well, this is all going to change. And they sent Biden out to send the message to Karzai in private that there's a new sheriff in town. And Biden goes in to see Karzai at the palace, and Karzai starts the way he always starts. He says, Mr. Vice President-elect, the problem is in Pakistan. You've got to do something about ISI. Stop talking about sending more troops to go into southern villages and kick down doors in my countryside. Start thinking about how you're going to deploy your pressure, your leverage, and your forces to end Pakistan's interference in the war. And Biden replies, Mr. President, Pakistan is 50 times more important to the United States than Afghanistan. Not the most diplomatic statement that anyone has ever made. You can imagine Karzai's reaction to a statement like that. But it also reflected the confusion or the kind of contradictions in US policy. Here these people were looking at the Pakistani nuclear weapons, 100 plus, getting smaller and more portable. Pakistan was quite unstable in 2009. You may remember the Pakistani Taliban had kind of marched out of Swat and menaced Islamabad briefly. There was fear that somehow they were going to march into Islamabad. It was an enormous period of domestic violence inside Pakistan in the aftermath of Benazir Bhutto's assassination. So it's not as if there was no basis to think about Pakistan, but very quickly, the United States made it clear to Karzai that they were not going to follow his advice. This was another contradiction of our relationship with him. We would always say, Mr. President, you are the sovereign president of Afghanistan, and we respect your constitutional role, and we respect your sovereignty. We're not going to do anything that you don't want us to do. And he'd say, in effect, maybe not as casually as this, I don't want you to fight the war that you're fighting. I want you to fight a different kind of war. And they'd say, well, Mr. President, yes, but this is the war that we're going to fight, and it's the one we're going to win. They went in to brief him on the counterinsurgency strategy in the summer of 2009, McChrystal and CIA station chief and Carl Eikenberry, who was then the US ambassador, and they did this like 40-minute PowerPoint for him about their plan to go into the south, into Helmand. The Marines were already in Helmand. They were going to roll into Kandahar and knock the Taliban out of the green zone west of Kandahar. And Karzai's taking notes. Somebody who was in the meeting said, I thought watching him that at first, his first reaction was, why don't I have aides who can make PowerPoint that looks like this? But then he watched the substance of the plan and he became more and more dismayed and he started writing less and less. And at the end, he basically said, this war is going to destabilize southern Afghanistan as much as it stabilizes it. And it was Eikenberry who kind of intervened in the conversation, and he said, well, I understand, Mr. President, if this was your troop deployment, you'd put 50,000 troops in Waziristan and the other 50,000 troops along the border. And he said, exactly, that's where I think the war is. Well, sovereign president of Afghanistan offered his asterisks and his notes, and the war went on as it had been designed. In a very South Asian way, you can understand what happened. So here is Karzai very consistently saying, why aren't you doing something about Pakistan? Why aren't you doing something about ISI? He was obviously not the only Afghan leader who felt this way. And yet, here's the world's greatest hyperpower, and it's unwilling to act. It has its explanations, but they don't quite convince. And so it's not too great a leap for Karzai to think, well, if they're not doing something about Pakistan and ISI, it must be because they want ISI to destabilize Afghanistan in order to justify a long-term US military presence in the region. Now, he started offering this hypothesis almost immediately after his encounter with Biden. Of course, it was very frustrating for the Americans. They kept trying to disabuse him of the idea, but he thought the logic kind of was pretty clear. And at one point, James Dobbins, a great diplomat, had something to do with the Bonn Agreement, and probably known to one or two of you, goes out, he's trying to negotiate this strategic agreement to keep US forces in the country. And Karzai is having none of it, and he keeps throwing this idea that you're letting ISI foster instability because you want to have a reason to be here forever. And Dobbins says to him, Mr. President, by now you have all of the WikiLeaks cables. You have all of the Snowden materials, millions and millions of classified documents. And can you find in those documents any evidence of this conspiracy? And Karzai kind of looks at him and half smiles and says, maybe you don't know the plan. There's a deep state in America. Yeah, well, we've heard that phrase more recently. Karzai's behavior became troubling to his own cabinet. They worried that he was going to destabilize the relationship with the United States to such an extent that the US would leave, or that the Taliban would find advantage in some way. There's a scene where one of his ministers goes walking with Karzai in the gardens of the palace, and Karzai's young son is with them. And the minister says, do you want this boy to grow up under a Taliban regime? I don't want that for my son. And he went on speaking to Karzai, Mr. President, I believe the United States has not been fair to you. They bring some good things. We should take some responsibility for the things that have gone wrong. They used to call you an Afghan Mandela. Now they call you an Afghan Mugabe. It's not fair. But if the Kabul government collapses, he said, the US will not be threatened. We will be wiped out. Karzai kind of danced his way to the exits, and you can see that he hasn't really stopped thinking the way that I described, or acting in the way that he did when he was in office, even today. I'll come back to that. So the counterinsurgency bubble. I was in Washington. I spent 20 years at the Washington Post. I was running a policy institute after I left the Post, while I was at the New Yorker during this period, 2009, when I was researching the book, 2010. And probably you guys were so far away from that kind of culture of people thinking about Afghanistan. It was the number one foreign policy question in the midst of a terrible economic crisis. And in the aftermath of the effort in Baghdad that had been led by General Petraeus in 2007 and 2008 to try to stabilize what was a deteriorating civil war in Iraq, there was an assumption that the application of counterinsurgency doctrine by the military in Iraq had saved the day, that it had overcome the self-defeating doctrines of the big army that had fought the Iraq War previously, and that only by connecting the people to the government and by providing security at a neighborhood level could wars of this type be stabilized. And that if this doctrine was transferred from Iraq to Afghanistan, that it would change the war, and that it would create the same pathway to perceived stability that the surge in Baghdad had created. A lot of assumptions under there that you could unpack and toss aside, but that was the core bubble. It was like Bitcoin. It was like the tulip bubble, and everyone was walking around with these books about French experience in Algeria or early French experience in Vietnam. This lovely army intellectual, good guy. I would think of him as a friend named John Noggle, who was a colonel, got a PhD, taught at West Point, and he was absolutely fired up about counterinsurgency doctrine. He wrote a book called Eating Soup with a Knife. And everyone was carrying this book around, all dog-eared, looking at it as if it was, the Green Book of a certain era in Libya. The problem was even applying counterinsurgency doctrine militarily to Afghanistan was a stretch, because there is a certain theory of counterinsurgency, and it involves a ratio of security forces to population. Basically, typical ratio of about 20 soldiers or police for every 1,000 inhabitants can be a basis for trying to stabilize a kind of insurgent-infested population. But in Afghanistan, if you did the math, that would require as many as 600,000 soldiers and police, including Afghan security forces. But even so, that was a completely unrealistic number in 2009, and it looks like an unrealistic number today. So to solve the problem, the math problem, they essentially took a map of Afghanistan, which has approximately 400-ish administrative districts, and they identified what they called 80 key terrain districts that could be where counterinsurgency could be applied, and that in the south and in the east mainly, and that would solve the math problem and win the war. Anyway, it didn't turn out that way. There were a lot of skeptics, even in the military, especially those who had felt the sting of this assumption that everybody in the Army was wrong except the counterinsurgency theorists. One of them was a general named Doug Lute, who was the principal advisor to first Bush and then Obama in the National Security Council on the region. And he was a colleague, sort of a protege of General Abizaid, the first Arab-American four-star general, who was very skeptical that the United States could stay anywhere for very long without provoking resistance. He was always saying, the clock is ticking, we've got to lower our footprint, we've got to manage this in a different way, which was sort of the opposite of the counterinsurgency hypothesis. And Lute used to, the phrase that everyone was using during this Bitcoin period was secure, hold, build, transfer. So secure, the Army goes in, hold, kind of stabilize the ground, build, government comes in, provides services, and then transfer that to the Afghan government. And Lute's advice was that the Afghan government had qualities in Kabul as an interlocutor with the international system, as a source of aspiration in some parts of Afghanistan, but that its capacity to deliver these kinds of services in Kandahar and Helmand was an illusion. And Lute told Obama, essentially, Mr. President, you can send a battalion of US Marines not only anywhere in Afghanistan, but literally anywhere in the world. They'll clear an area, and as long as you're willing to keep them there, they'll hold it. The problem is handing the cleared area to a government that can do something with it. One more contradiction as we wind down. That's Richard Holbrooke. He was the special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan appointed by President Obama. And he worked at the Secretary of State directly for Secretary Clinton. He had been involved in the negotiations in Bosnia that ended that civil war. And he was very ambitious, and he desperately wanted to play a role in ending the Afghan conflict. But he was a very big personality, and he irritated the president. And one of the reasons that he irritated the president was that he kept talking about Vietnam, where he had served as a young civil servant in the Cords period in South Vietnam. And he would make comparisons about what he had experienced there, what American history showed about Vietnam, and to what the president was contemplating in Afghanistan, especially with the big counterinsurgency investment. And the president found this annoying, very annoying, and sent a message to the Secretary of State, basically tell him never to bring up Vietnam in the presence of the president again. Just tell him to stop it. And Holbrooke was one of those people that in my trade, you would say that he's good for journalism. That is to say, he's accessible, he dishes, he's gossipy, he's interesting. And so I used to try and stay in touch with him. A lot of journalists, I'm sure, did. And right after this happened, apparently, I didn't know it, he agreed to have lunch at, in Georgetown on a Saturday, just kind of catch up on what was going on with his efforts on the political side. And he was mortified that he had been told that he couldn't mention Vietnam. I had a tape recorder running. We were on background, but I knew I was doing my book research. He died tragically at the end of 2010, so I follow the Woodward rule that it's off the record until you're no longer with us, and then it's not. He said, he was telling me this, and then he paused and he said, they shouldn't be so afraid of history, which I thought was, when I read that transcript many years later, I thought it kind of resonated. The book recounts a fascinating negotiation that the United States had with the Taliban after Holbrooke's death, primarily. He kind of set it up, but it was carried on by Mark Grossman, his successor, and some other folks who were involved in it. They encountered this Afghan who was advertised himself as the head of the political commission, a man named Tyaga, who is there. He had been an aide to Mullah Muhammad Omar in Kandahar back in the day, in the early Taliban days. He would occasionally give statements to the BBC. He was sort of a known figure. He was very young, and it wasn't really clear what authority he had. So a lot of the early negotiations were about getting him to prove that he was really authorized by the Taliban high leadership to carry out this negotiation. And he did that by providing a proof of life video of Bo Bergdahl, who was being held by the Haqqani network, and the fact that he could get the Haqqanis to pass that all the way through was seen as evidence that he was really working for the Shura, probably mostly for Mansour. The Americans started to collect intelligence about him. They could see that he definitely had contact with Mansour, but where Mullah Muhammad Omar figured behind that was unclear. They decided to negotiate with him. The Germans had been in contact with him, and the Germans set up the negotiation. They wanted the Americans and the Taliban to start talking to one another. And so they set up an initial meeting at a safe house outside of Munich. And Obama authorized this. It was very compartmented, highly secret at the time. There were occasional sort of partial leaks, but this first meeting was completely under wraps. And about 2 weeks before the meeting, message came in from the Germans that had been setting this up. Look, Tyaga is ready to go. The Germans were going to fly him in on one of their intelligence services planes from Qatar into Munich and then fly him back. And the Germans passed the message to the Americans, he's willing to go, but he has a question. He's worried that he's going to be arrested and sent to Guantanamo at the meeting. And he notes that a number of his Taliban friends have had this happen to them when they went to meetings with the Americans. And so Obama told his aides, look, give him my absolute personal guarantee. He's not going to be snatched. Nothing like that is going to happen. No matter what happens in our discussions, he's going to get back on that plane and go back to Qatar, and we'll be fine. And so they relayed that message back to the Germans, and Germans relayed back that he was satisfied with Obama's personal guarantee. And then the National Security Staff got together about a week before the meeting, and they said, you know what? This government of ours is a very big and secretive beast. What if there's like some list that he's on, or some automatic snatch machine that is gets kicked into action when word of someone is on the move? Let's not tell the CIA or the Pentagon where this meeting is going to take place, what the tail number is of the German plane, nothing. Let's just keep it to ourselves. I thought as an American that was slightly disconcerting, that even the National Security Council didn't want to put out the word. I'll finish now. I'm happy to talk more about the political track. I think the big point about the history up until 2016 was that it was under-resourced. Holbrooke's marginalization was one kind of odd reason of personal politics why it was under-resourced. But here you have a president whose legacy includes Herculean feats of international diplomacy, the Iran nuclear deal, the opening to Cuba, high risk, very complicated great power negotiations in one case, and the other back-channel diplomacy around a hot rail subject in American politics. So it's not like this presidency wasn't up for the hard stuff, the risky stuff. But somehow this negotiation was never taken very seriously. It wasn't resourced at the highest levels. It wasn't connected to a plan, a strategy in the region. And this is the last contradiction of our experience there, which is that every military commander who goes over from the US side to command the war for a year or two at a time, they'll say out loud, this is not a war that can be won by purely military means. Petraeus was the one who said, even during his tour as a counterinsurgency general, said, you can't capture and kill your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. And yet, it was the military campaign, year after year, that was resourced above all others and didn't have a complementary track of international diplomacy. And ironically, the Trump administration, because it has a president who isn't sure about the American commitment to Afghanistan, is probably going further to try to figure out what a viable political strategy might be than any administration before it. So thank you for listening, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. Steve will handle the questions. If you
Just remember the microphone.
remember the microphone. So raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you. Let me use the prerogative as organizer to ask the first question, and that would be, is it the fact that Trump cares so little about this that actually gives more latitude for negotiations than people who essentially have immersed themselves? Is there almost an irony that someone that everyone knows doesn't care about it actually could be seen as the one that is more willing to get out, more willing to screw Pakistan, more willing to know God's what, that has actually focused the attention in a way that seems to produce strange results, even if unintended by the initiator?
I mean, I think so. I mean, it's a strange sort of leverage in international affairs, and it doesn't always cut in a positive direction, obviously, but the question is really, this is such a hard problem, and there really is no easy or fast solution to it. So if the attitude is you're going to cut a deal, as in North Korea, you're going to find that you can pretend to cut a deal, but a deal is something else. A deal requires alliances, a deal requires a plan, it requires time, it requires patience, it requires a sense of direction. And this has been a very difficult subject within Afghan politics, within Afghanistan, and you can't just do it on the back of an envelope. So, I mean, he's appointed Zalmay Khalilzad, who is probably the best Republican available for the job, and I don't know what I haven't talked to him since he started working on this, but he's clearly picked up the threads that the Obama administration abandoned in 2013. He's gone to the Qatar office, he's gotten the Gitmo detainees, into a political position. He's gotten Barater out of prison in Pakistan, according to the newspapers, though I understand his health has always been quite poor for some period of time, so that's more symbolic. And now he's got to get through 2019 to have an Afghan government on side that understands kind of what sequence it's comfortable with and is unified enough to participate. And so, you got to assume that this president is just going to let Pompeo and Khalilzad do their thing. And if they have something positive to report, he'll be happy to hear about it. So.
What really has changed since the cover since power transformation from Bush administration to Karzai administration and from there to Trump administration, what has really changed in US policy about Afghanistan?
Not very much. I would say between the last Bush administration's policy review, which was carried out in 2008 and kind of handed off as a document to the Obama administration, between that time and the Trump administration policy review that was announced in his speech in August 2017, was much more continuity than change. Things you could pull out and identify as departures, not in the overall picture, but in tactics or in priorities, would be what we talked about, Obama's attitude towards Karzai, which turned chilly really fast. I don't think there was really much difference in military doctrine. If the Bush administration had had a third term, they would have probably gone in the same direction that the Obama administration did. The other big departure would be the Trump administration's suspension of aid to Pakistan and the presidential tweets accompanying that decision. And they have continued to take a firmer line about Pakistani conduct than either of the two previous administrations. I think there's two things to say about that. One, President Bush allowed himself to be caught up in his relationship with Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf, General Musharraf. He really bought into Musharraf in a big way, and in that personal style of diplomacy was failed by his trust in Musharraf. And it was really only toward the end of his presidency that he began to realize that he'd been had, and that ISI had been deliberately working against American interests and plans, and that Musharraf had not only known about it, but had probably authorized it. So that's one element of it. You have to say, in fairness to the Obama team about Pakistan, that, as I mentioned, Pakistan in 2009 to 2012 was a very different place than it was when President Trump tweeted out his displeasure, I guess at the beginning of this year, because Pakistan was suffering the worst period of domestic violence and terrorism that it had experienced since 1971. And thousands of people died every year, civilians, security forces, insurgents, and the country was highly unstable. And so there was a limit. The big project and the kind of truth behind Biden's crack to Karzai about Pakistan being more important was that there was a genuine anxiety that this time Pakistan, which some people would say is the most skilled country in the world at negotiating with a gun pointed to its own head, that this time it was really going to pull the trigger and it was really going to fall apart and the world was really going to suffer. And so there was a reluctance to go in with pressure. And so you ended up with this typical thing that happens in diplomacy, I'm afraid, where you provide all of the economic incentives as before because you think they're stabilizing, and then you go into these meetings one-on-one in private and you read out what my son the lawyer calls strongly worded letters. We object to what you're doing. Please stop doing it. And the Pakistanis would get these démarches over and over and over again. It was just like elevator music at a certain point. And it was coming from so many different places, so many different people. However strongly worded they were, they didn't come with anything consequential. And that really never changed, even as Pakistan, after the killing of bin Laden, obviously the relationship reset. There was mutual disillusionment and anger on both sides, and the U.S. presence in Pakistan was much reduced. Also, U.S. leverage in Pakistan was much reduced. But even so, all the way through the end of the Obama years, in part because I think they were hoping that somehow they could get a Taliban negotiation of some sort back on track. They needed the Pakistanis to make that work. They still never really departed from their strongly worded letter approach. And the Trump administration came in and said, enough is enough. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for the very illuminating lecture. I have two questions. One is, again, regarding the Pakistan. What do you think, how far the Trump administration can go on Pakistan? Because there is a notion that further pressure on Pakistan will tilt it toward China, which maybe the US does not want it. And the second question is about the Russian role. Do you think any time in the future Russia can get along with the US on negotiation with the Taliban? And how do you assess the Russian recent efforts to kind of design its own negotiation and regional alignments in regards to negotiation with the Taliban? Thank you.
Yeah, they're both very good questions. Try to be concise. I think in the case of Pakistan's relationship with China, you're right. I mean, Pakistan is already nesting inside its relationship with China. It's the most important alliance that Pakistan has. It has been for a long time. And importantly, it's the most important alliance in the world China has. China is not a nation of allies the way the United States has been. I was involved with, during the, I guess, first part of the Obama second term with some track 2 dialogues, track 1.5 dialogues with the Chinese about Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I was really struck in that their specialists would say, you know, there is no country in the world that we have a relationship with like the one we have with Pakistan. And of course, they gave Pakistan a nuclear weapon to balance India. It's not always a mutually happy relationship, but it's a very deep one. And so I don't think the Americans would worry about tilting Pakistan toward China because Pakistan is already there. The question would be, can the United States and China find a means to pursue what is in fact their shared interest, which is that Afghanistan becomes stable and that it not collapse into violence that will inevitably spill across borders, that will inevitably fuel violent extremism. And this is China's neighborhood. China's trying to build a whole series of economic and political corridors across Central Asia. And if Afghanistan is going to fall back into a 10-year war, that is going to seriously disrupt China's project. You know, you can say as an American, well, the Chinese have been free riding on the security we have built up in NATO, but that's because we have a common interest in a stable Afghanistan. So the problem with Afghanistan in the US-China relationship is the same as it is, in a sense, with Russia, which is that Afghanistan becomes hostage to other problems in the great power relationship. So even back in 2012, when we would have these discussions about how we both had an interest in, both of our countries had an interest in a stable Pakistan that was not interfering violently in Afghanistan, and a stable Afghanistan that was consolidating constitutional government and preparing for economic development that would, by the way, benefit China. Okay, we could agree in principle at 30,000 feet on all of that, but then the Chinese side would point out, you know, we can't get onto the agenda of US-China relationships with these subjects. I mean, we've got South China Sea, we've got North Korea, we've got trade. I mean, you know, we're way down the list. And to get the Chinese government to come off of its relationship with Pakistan and really take some risks in a regional diplomatic sense, especially with India's presence in Afghanistan, very hard. As to Russia, you know, the Russians right now, because of the sanctions that have been imposed over Crimea and other violations of Ukrainian sovereignty and other transgressions by the United States and Europe, I mean, Russia's posture right now is just one of disruption. Anything that will undermine the United States, they're interested in it. And that has brought them in lots of strange directions. If somehow that relationship stabilized and became more of like what it was in 2011 before the Syrian war or before the invasion of Crimea. Yes, the United States and Russia have a common interest in a stable Afghanistan. And I think the Russians watched the United States going into Afghanistan after 2001 and basically said, well, good luck with that. But they were not uncooperative or disruptive until very recently. And I think it's inseparable from the context of the kind of collapse of cooperation across many lines between the United States and Russia.
Thank you. I'm just going to come back to the issue of these peace negotiations. In Afghanistan, at least among different groups and different circles, there is some sort of a general agreement about the necessity and importance of having peace with the Taliban. But there is a lot of questions about, is there any sort of a consensus within the ISI and Pakistan establishment on what peace might look between Taliban and Afghanistan? So far, I'm asking this because there were several kind of reports or something that those Taliban who wanted to actually go and negotiate with the Afghan government, or even the local level, they were assassinated in Pakistan by the ISI. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the most difficult subject to analyze because it involves the darkest corners of the ISI kind of apparatus and who's making decisions. I think, in the Kayani era, and I think with the current Chief of Army Staff, at the top level, at the strategic level, I think there's, the main objective of the Pakistan Army since 2009, especially since 2012, when they kind of started to get domestic security restored, has been to push instability into Afghanistan and to kind of ring fence Pakistan. So this has been both rhetorical and military operations. They've tried to basically get their own Waziristan problem into Nangarhar, just push it over the border and then try to secure the border as much as possible and basically make it clear to domestic radicals that if you attack the Pakistani state, you're dead or you're exiled. And if you cooperate with the Pakistani state, you can have political space and economic space. So where do the Afghan Taliban fit in that policy? I think, if the Pakistan Army could figure out a way to increase its forward defenses in Afghanistan by seeing the Taliban become part of the political fabric of a more stable Afghanistan, especially in the east and south, where there would naturally, be contenders in a political arrangement, that they would, if they didn't have to pay too high of a price or take too many risks, there was a time when they were signaling the Americans, that's an outcome we would like. They're very cautious. The Taliban aren't always responsive to Pakistani coercion and pressure. That's why they assassinate Taliban that are uncooperative. They're afraid of being exposed about how little leverage they actually have over the Taliban. And their main thing is they're trying to secure Pakistani soil, and why should they take big political risks to solve Afghanistan's problems? That's been their attitude. But to the extent they were willing, what they were signaling was, forget about Bond 2. Forget about like a huge constitutional settlement that everyone can sign up for and we can have a big Loya Jirga and the war's over. We've got to take some steps toward that. We've got to build confidence. We've got to have ceasefires. We've got to have local negotiated political arrangements. Some of these may be off the books. Some of them may be little experiments. And I was reading recently some histories of the conflict between two parties in the Middle East that will never reconcile themselves to one another's existence, Hezbollah and the State of Israel. And yet, since Hezbollah became the dominant militia in southern Lebanon, the Israeli security forces and Hezbollah have continually negotiated these agreements that are called rules of the game. They're written down on unsigned pieces of paper, and they basically keep the civilians out of the war, and don't escalate beyond this, or here is your, and it's a kind of sophistication that also predated the settlement in Northern Ireland. A lot of back-channel negotiations about keeping civilians out of the war, political messaging. And the Pakistanis were essentially proposing to the Americans about the Taliban, let's try it that way. Let's let's do some demonstration projects and let's see what that shows us. And the truth is that the American system is very bad at that kind of thing. Like we've got these big aircraft carriers that we can sail around the world, and we can put cruise missiles down on a GPS target, and we can have a big conference, and we can write big checks, but like back channel negotiations like that and ceasefires, it's really, now they did pull this off. Somebody pulled it off in the spring with the Eid ceasefire, and it was, I think, it was obviously the Pakistanis signed up for this in a back channel negotiation, and the Americans were clearly involved, and the Taliban Political Commission demonstrated something that the Americans really discovered in their negotiation, which is that they can enforce a decision all the way down their chain of command, right? I mean, it was only the Islamic State that attacked during the ceasefire, and they never signed up for the ceasefire in the first place. The Taliban are always being described as fragmentary and disorganized, and no, they've got a chain of command. And that ceasefire, which I think certainly was just one period of 3 days, and there are concerns you can express about it, but I mean, peace like war requires a collective imagination. It requires images. It requires a sense of what could be possible here. War is the dark version of that, how violence disrupts people's sense of self and place and community and family. But those images from that ceasefire of what it might be like, to live in a less violent Afghanistan where there was more cooperation, my sense is they were very powerful. And so it does demonstrate that these kind of confidence building measures, the kind of sophisticated way of building momentum toward political negotiations, it has a role. It has a role to play in Afghanistan, I think. And yes, you do have to get people to the table, and you have to start talking about process. But President Ghani has basically sent all the signals that it's possible for the president of Afghanistan to signal about what he's willing to talk about. And now the Americans are in it, at some level of attention. So we'll see. I mean, I certainly agree with you that Afghans that I know are themselves willing to participate, to take some risks, to recognize that there's got to be some pathway to preserve all the gains, that this younger generation enjoys in cities and elsewhere. Maybe this will be the last one. We'll let you eat.
You've mentioned sort of the parallels to Vietnam, especially in Afghanistan, if only in the fact that failure has kind of been met with doing more of the same things and expecting different results. I'm curious, and this might be a little off topic, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on why the reaction from the American public has been so different between the two wars, given how long the war in Afghanistan has gone on for.
Good question. I think 3 reasons. First, the war started in response to the September 11th attacks, and the sense that this was a just response to the attacks was widely shared around the world. Dozens and dozens of governments are still involved in trying to stabilize Afghanistan. And of course, there was also a recognition that the conditions that had led to the rise of the Taliban and the migration of al-Qaeda to Afghanistan were inseparable from the involvement of the United States in the 1980s war, and then the decision to essentially walk away from the country during the early 90s after the Cold War ended. So that's one factor. There was a national narrative about Afghanistan and September 11th that endured all the way up, certainly until bin Laden's killing. Second reason is that the casualties in Afghanistan for the U.S., though tragic and highly impactful in the families and communities where they have been felt, were a tiny fraction of the casualties in the Vietnam War. I'm sure you've all walked that wall in Washington, D.C., but it was a different order of magnitude. And third, and probably this is the biggest reason politically, I would guess, is that the Vietnam Army was a draft army, and the Afghan Army and the Iraq Army were volunteer armies. And this was something that the Army wanted, the military wanted for itself after Vietnam, when the quality of the military forces had so deteriorated because of drug addiction and draftees who didn't want to be there, that the military itself wanted to build a professional fighting force out of people who wanted to serve and who would volunteer to serve. And I think in terms of what it delivered in kind of professionalism and military professionalism, except in the period when the Army was so completely strained and overstretched when fighting two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, say between 2005 and 2012, it did achieve those goals. But we can see this in our country. Where do the volunteers for these wars come from? Where do the casualties who have lost limbs? And military medicine has gotten so much better since the Vietnam War, and the commanders worked so hard to get American soldiers onto the operating table within that 30 minutes of life, that the ratio of death to wounds in war now is so much higher than it was in any previous generation. And so you have lots of damaged folks coming home to the communities that they left. And many of them are bitter or confused about the decisions of the elites that sent them off to fight. They may not be persuaded that it was a righteous cause. Certainly, a lot of people come back wounded and angry. And if you look at the map where the American military volunteers, and you think about the populism and the politics that's afoot in our country now, the anger that's afoot in our country now, there's a correlation. And it's not just a Trump vote, it's a Bernie vote too. It's like, you're all wrong. and if you've lived through like a bad war and misleading commanders and you've lost your legs for it, this is Vietnam scale division or certainly impact. It's just more localized, and it reflects the structure of our decision to have a volunteer army. I mean, it raises the question of where national service figures in unifying a country like this one. It doesn't necessarily have to be military service, but I do think we pay a price for the way we organize our expeditionary fighting forces. All right, thank you so much for listening.